Commander Masatake Okumiya stood on the flight deck of what had been the USS Essex, now silent and anchored in Tokyo Bay, on the morning of September 28, 1945. The war had been over for 23 days. Around him, American sailors worked with casual efficiency, moving equipment, securing lines, performing the mundane tasks of peacetime naval operations. But Okumiya wasn't watching the sailors. He was watching the deck itself, measuring it with his eyes, counting painted lines and tie-down points, trying to understand something that seemed impossible. He had been a carrier aviation staff officer throughout the war. He had planned strikes from the decks of Shokaku and Zuikaku. He had calculated sortie rates and recovery times. He had written the doctrinal manuals that governed Japanese carrier operations. He understood, or thought he understood, the mathematics of carrier aviation. And the mathematics told him that what the Americans claimed about this ship could not be true. The Essex-class carriers, according to captured documents he had reviewed in the weeks since surrender, could launch their entire air group of 90 to 100 aircraft in approximately 30 to 40 minutes. They could recover that same air group, rearm it, refuel it, and launch it again within 2 hours. They could sustain this cycle for days, generating hundreds of sorties in continuous operations that never seemed to pause or falter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Okumiya had read these figures in the intelligence reports. He had dismissed them as American exaggeration, the kind of inflated claims that all militaries made about their capabilities. But now, standing on the deck of an actual Essex-class carrier, seeing the physical layout with his own eyes, he was beginning to understand that the reports had not exaggerated. If anything, they had understated the reality. The deck stretched 472 feet from the flight deck's forward edge to the stern. It was wide, 80 feet at the widest point, with enough space to spot dozens of aircraft simultaneously. 3 elevators, each capable of lifting 2 aircraft at once, connected the hangar deck below to the flight deck above. The catapults, 2 on the bow, could accelerate a fully loaded aircraft to flying speed in less than 3 seconds. But it wasn't just the equipment that troubled Okumiya. It was the design philosophy it represented. Everything about this ship spoke of assumptions that were fundamentally different from Japanese carrier design. The Americans had built this vessel to generate mass, to launch attacks in overwhelming numbers, to sustain operations at a tempo that would exhaust any opponent. They had not built it for elegant efficiency or for preserving their most valuable assets. They had built it for industrial warfare, at a scale that Okumiya was only now beginning to comprehend. He pulled out his notebook, the same one he had carried throughout the war, and began writing calculations. If the Americans could launch 100 aircraft in 40 minutes, that was 2.5 aircraft per minute, or 1 aircraft every 24 seconds. That rate, sustained across multiple carriers operating together, meant the Americans could put more aircraft into the sky in a single morning than the entire combined fleet could have launched at its peak strength in 1942. The numbers were devastating, but more devastating was the realization of what they meant. This wasn't just about carrier operations. This was about a kind of warfare that Japan had never prepared for, had never imagined, and could never have won. To understand what Okumiya was confronting on that September morning, one must first understand what Japanese naval aviation had believed about carrier warfare. These beliefs were not arbitrary. They were the product of careful analysis, successful experience, and rational assessment of Japan's strategic position. They were also completely inadequate for the war Japan actually fought. Japanese carrier doctrine in 1941 was built on the concept of the decisive battle. This idea had dominated Japanese naval thinking since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, when Admiral Togo Haihachiro had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in a single afternoon of concentrated gunnery. The lesson Japanese naval officers drew from Tsushima was clear. Victory came through qualitative superiority at the decisive moment. Train better crews, build superior ships, concentrate your forces, and strike with overwhelming skill at the critical point. Applied to carrier aviation, this doctrine meant several things. First, Japanese carriers would embark the finest pilots in the world. Entry requirements for naval aviation were extraordinarily demanding. Candidates needed completed secondary education, a rarity in Japan. They needed perfect health, excellent eyesight, and superior physical conditioning. Of thousands who applied, only a handful were accepted. Training lasted 3 years. Pilots accumulated 800 to 1,000 flight hours before joining fleet squadrons, compared to 200 to 300 hours for American naval aviators in the early war period. They practiced navigation over open ocean, night carrier landings, and precision dive bombing until these skills became instinctive. By 1941, Japanese carrier pilots were arguably the most skilled in the world. Second, Japanese carriers would carry aircraft of exceptional quality. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, introduced in 1940, was faster than any Allied fighter in the Pacific, more maneuverable, and had greater range. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber could deliver the deadly Type 91 torpedo with remarkable accuracy. The Nakajima B-5N Aichi D-3, a dive bomber, was stable, precise, and effective. These were not weapons of mass production. They were precision instruments crafted for expert operators. Third, Japanese carriers themselves reflected this emphasis on quality over quantity. The Shokaku-class carriers, completed in 1941, were magnificent vessels. They displaced 25,000 tons empty, 32,000 tons fully loaded. They could make 34 knots, fast enough to operate anywhere in the Pacific. Their armored flight decks could resist bomb hits that would cripple lesser ships, but their air groups were deliberately limited. Shokaku embarked 72 aircraft, 27 fighters, 27 dive bombers, 18 torpedo bombers. This was not because Japanese designers couldn't fit more aircraft aboard. It was because Japanese doctrine prioritized having enough space to properly maintain aircraft, to give pilots adequate rest between missions, to ensure that every sortie was flown by fresh, skilled crews operating well-maintained machines. Japanese carriers had enclosed hangars with thick steel sides and armored doors. This protected aircraft from weather and battle damage, but it also limited capacity. Aircraft had to be moved via elevator between the hangar deck and flight deck. Deck parks, the American practice of storing aircraft on the flight deck itself, were considered dangerous and inefficient. Launch operations reflected this careful, methodical approach. A Japanese carrier would typically prepare its entire air group below in the hangar deck. Elevators would bring aircraft topside in groups. Deck crews would position them, conduct final checks, and start engines. The entire air group would launch together in a carefully coordinated evolution that might take an hour or more from first engine start to last aircraft airborne. This wasn't inefficiency. It was quality control. Every aircraft was properly prepared. Every pilot was fully briefed. Every weapon was correctly loaded and armed. The strike package would arrive at the target together, at the planned time, with all elements coordinated. This was precision warfare, executed by professionals, and it worked brilliantly. At Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aviation demonstrated what this doctrine could accomplish. 6 carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves. The first wave achieved complete surprise, destroying or damaging 8 battleships and numerous other vessels. The second wave pressed the attack despite stiffening resistance. Total Japanese losses: 29 aircraft. The success at Pearl Harbor was not an isolated victory. In the 6 months that followed, Japanese carrier aviation dominated the Pacific with a string of triumphs that seemed to validate every assumption of their doctrine. On April 5, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the fast carrier strike force, entered the Indian Ocean with 5 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and Shokaku. Their target was the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet, based at Ceylon. On April 9th, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Colombo Harbour, sinking the heavy cruiser Cornwall and the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire. On April 9, they struck Trincomalee, sinking the carrier Hermes, the destroyer Vampire, and numerous merchant vessels. British Admiral Sir James Somerville, commanding the Eastern Fleet, withdrew to East Africa. He recognized that his fleet, built around old battleships and a single aircraft carrier, could not contest control of the Indian Ocean against Japanese carrier power. The Bay of Bengal became a Japanese lake, merchant shipping fled, India seemed threatened. The strategic situation appeared desperate. For Japanese naval aviators, these victories confirmed their superiority. They had defeated the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. They had driven the Royal Navy from Asian waters. Their carriers operated with impunity across thousands of miles of ocean. Their pilots returned from missions with tales of easy victories against inferior opponents. The quality of Japanese naval aviation in this period was not propaganda. It was real. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros in early 1942 described aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange anything the US Navy flew. Marine pilots on Guadalcanal in August 1942 faced Japanese naval aviators flying from carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku and found themselves badly outmatched in individual dogfights. Japanese confidence extended beyond tactics to technology. The enclosed hangars on Japanese carriers were considered superior to American open hangars. The armored flight decks on Shokaku-class carriers could resist bomb damage. The long range of Japanese carrier aircraft meant they could strike first, hitting enemy carriers before those carriers could launch their own strikes. This range advantage was particularly significant. An A6M0 carrying a drop tank had a combat radius of over 600 miles. This meant Japanese carriers could launch strikes at targets 300 miles away, have their aircraft fight at that distance, and recover them safely. American carrier aircraft in 1942 had much shorter range, forcing American carriers to close to within 200 miles of targets to launch effective strikes. The mathematics seemed to favor Japan. Japanese carriers could strike first. Japanese pilots were better trained. Japanese aircraft were superior in individual combat. If carrier warfare came down to quality versus quality, Japan would win. And in 1942, carrier warfare did come down to quality versus quality. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, Japanese carrier aircraft damaged the carrier Lexington badly enough that she had to be scuttled. At the Battle of Midway in June, despite losing 4 carriers, Japanese pilots had pressed their attacks with skill and courage that impressed even their enemies. The losses at Midway were severe, but they did not fundamentally challenge Japanese carrier doctrine. The battle had been lost through poor intelligence, bad luck, and timing. The quality of Japanese naval aviation remained intact. Shokaku and Zuikaku, the best carriers in the fleet, had survived. Pilots could be retrained. Carriers could be built, though slowly. The core assumption, that qualitative superiority would prevail, remained unquestioned. This assumption would persist through the battles of 1943 and into 1944. Even as losses mounted, even as replacement pilots proved less skilled than pre-war aviators, even as American forces grew stronger, Japanese naval officers continued to believe that their doctrine was sound. They attributed setbacks to insufficient numbers, to bad luck, to American material advantages. They did not question whether their fundamental approach to carrier warfare was obsolete. Commander Okumiya had participated in this thinking. He had planned operations based on these assumptions. He had calculated that Japanese carriers, with their carefully maintained aircraft and expertly trained pilots, could match or defeat larger American forces through superior skill and coordination. The mathematics of his planning had always been about quality. How many expert pilots, how many precision strikes, how much damage could be inflicted by a smaller number of superbly executed attacks. Standing on the deck of Essex in September 1945, Okumiya was beginning to understand that he had been calculating the wrong equation entirely. The Americans had not been trying to match Japanese quality. They had not been competing in the same contest. They had been building a completely different kind of carrier warfare, one based on principles that had never occurred to Japanese planners. The USS Essex, CV-9, was commissioned on December 31, 1942. She was the lead ship of a class that would eventually number 24 vessels. the largest class of aircraft carriers ever built by any nation. But these numbers alone did not capture what made the Essex class revolutionary. The revolution was in the design philosophy, in assumptions about how carriers would be used in sustained combat operations. The Essex class was 872 feet long overall, with a flight deck 862 feet in length. The flight deck was 108 feet wide at its maximum beam, narrowing to 93 feet at the waist. This was wider than Japanese carrier decks, but not dramatically so. Shokaku's flight deck was 842 feet long and 95 feet wide. The dimensions were comparable. The critical differences lay elsewhere. Essex had 3 elevators connecting the hangar deck to the flight deck. 2 were centerline elevators, positioned along the ship's longitudinal axis. The third was a deck-edge elevator, mounted on the starboard side, that could lift aircraft without interfering with flight operations. Each elevator platform measured 60 feet by 48 feet and could lift 2 aircraft simultaneously. The hydraulic systems could complete a full cycle, from hangar to flight deck and back, in approximately 20 seconds. 20 seconds. Commander Okumiya had timed elevator cycles on Japanese carriers. Shokaku's elevators, well-maintained and efficiently operated, needed approximately 45 seconds for a full cycle. This difference compounded across dozens of aircraft movements. What took Japanese carriers 90 minutes, Essex could accomplish in 40. But elevator speed was only part of the equation. Essex's hangar deck was designed as a staging area, not as protected storage. The hangar bay was 654 feet long, with a clear height of 17.5 feet, enough to accommodate any aircraft the US Navy operated. But unlike Japanese carriers with their enclosed armored hangars, Essex had an open hangar design. The sides were not solid steel but consisted of rolling curtains that could be raised or lowered. In combat, these curtains would be rolled up, allowing ventilation and making the hangar essentially open to the elements. This design horrified Japanese naval architects who examined it. Open hangars meant aircraft were exposed to weather, to salt spray, to battle damage from near misses. But the Americans had calculated differently. Open hangars meant better ventilation, reducing the risk of aviation fuel vapor accumulation. They meant that bomb hits on the hangar deck would vent outward, rather than building up pressure that could rupture the ship's structure. And, most importantly, they meant that aircraft could be moved quickly without worrying about maintaining environmental controls. The flight deck itself was wooden planks laid over the steel deck structure. This was not armor. A bomb penetrating this deck would explode in the hangar bay below, but wooden decks were lighter than armored decks, allowing the ship to carry more aircraft and fuel. And wooden decks could be repaired quickly. Damaged sections could be cut out and replaced within hours using materials and tools the ship carried. Armored decks, once damaged, required shipyard facilities to repair properly. Essex carried 2 hydraulic catapults on the flight deck, positioned at the bow. These were H-4B catapults, capable of accelerating a 14,000-pound aircraft from 0 to 90 miles per hour in approximately 250 feet of deck run. Launch time, from when the aircraft was positioned on the catapult to when it was airborne, was approximately 30 seconds. Older American carriers and all Japanese carriers relied on free takeoff runs, requiring more deck space and more time per launch. The air group composition reflected American thinking about sustained operations. Essex's standard air group in 1944 consisted of approximately 36 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. That was 90 aircraft, but the ship could embark over 100 aircraft when necessary by using deck parks and tight spotting. Deck parks meant storing aircraft on the flight deck itself, not just in the hangar. American carriers routinely spotted 30 to 40 aircraft on the flight deck overnight or between operations. These aircraft were tied down, chocked, and ready to launch. At dawn, they could be started, warmed up, and launched without ever using the elevators. This practice was considered dangerous by Japanese standards, exposing valuable aircraft to weather and making the flight deck unusable for recovery operations. But it allowed much faster launch cycles. American aircraft themselves were designed for different priorities than their Japanese counterparts. The F-6F Hellcat fighter, which entered service in January 1943, was heavier and less maneuverable than the Zero, but it was rugged, with armor plate protecting the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires when hit. It had 6 50-caliber machine guns with substantial ammunition loads, and it was designed for ease of maintenance and rapid turnaround. A Hellcat could be rearmed and refueled by a trained deck crew in approximately 15 minutes. The ammunition bays were accessible from the wing's underside. Fuel ports were clearly marked and standardized. Gun cameras could be quickly removed and film replaced. The entire aircraft was designed so that most maintenance could be performed by the deck crew without taking the aircraft below to the hangar. Japanese aircraft required more careful handling. Zeros were light, with thin aluminum skin that could be damaged by careless handling. Their engines needed precise adjustment. Rearming required more time because ammunition types had to be carefully selected and loaded. Maintenance was more complex, often requiring specialized personnel. This meant longer turnaround times between sorties. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Essex's aviation fuel capacity was exemplary even by American standards. The ship carried over 240,000 gallons of aviation gasoline in multiple tanks distributed throughout the ship. Fuel lines ran to multiple fueling stations on the flight and hangar decks. Multiple aircraft could be fueled simultaneously without interfering with other operations. By contrast, Japanese carriers carried less fuel and had fewer fueling stations, creating bottlenecks during rapid turnaround operations. The crew size reflected the operational tempo Essex was designed to sustain. The ship's company, not counting the air group, numbered over 2,000 men. Of these, several hundred were dedicated deck crew responsible for aircraft handling. Flight deck crews were organized into color-coded teams. Men wearing yellow jerseys were aircraft handlers, directing aircraft movement. Men in blue were chock and chain crews, securing aircraft. Men in red handled ordnance and weapons. Men in green operated catapults and arresting gear. This color coding allowed instant recognition of function, critical during the controlled chaos of launch and recovery operations. Commander Okumiya had brought his notebook filled with calculations from Japanese carrier operations. Now, standing on Essex's flight deck with an American liaison officer who spoke functional Japanese, he began asking technical questions. The American officer, a lieutenant commander who had served on Essex during the Philippine Sea Campaign, answered with the casual precision of someone describing routine procedures. How long did it take to launch a full deck load? The lieutenant commander considered this. 36 aircraft spotted on deck, already fueled and armed. Approximately 20 minutes from first engine start to last aircraft airborne. If they used both catapults and free takeoff rolls simultaneously, faster, Okumiya calculated silently. 20 minutes for 36 aircraft meant one aircraft every 33 seconds on average. That rate exceeded anything Japanese carriers had achieved even in peacetime exercises with unlimited time for preparation. How long to recover the air group? The lieutenant commander shrugged. Depended on circumstances. Aircraft returning from a strike, most with some battle damage, perhaps 30 minutes for the full air group. In emergencies, they had recovered faster, but that increased the risk of accidents. What was the typical turnaround time between launching a strike and being ready to launch again? The American officer thought about this more carefully. If they had advance warning, if the returning aircraft were already being prepared while the previous strike was being recovered, they could turn around a full strike package in approximately 90 minutes. That included recovery, rearming, refueling, spot-checking aircraft for battle damage, briefing pilots for the next mission, respotting aircraft on deck, and launching. Okumiya had calculated that Japanese carriers needed a minimum of 3 hours for the same cycle, and that was under ideal conditions with no combat damage and experienced crews. But the American officer was still talking. He mentioned that during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Essex had launched multiple strikes throughout the day. He couldn't remember exact numbers, he said apologetically, but it had been a long day with aircraft launching and recovering almost continuously from before dawn until after dark. Okumiya knew about the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In Japanese accounts, it was called the Ago Operation, or, more bitterly, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier aircraft had attacked American carrier task forces and had been slaughtered. Of approximately 373 Japanese carrier aircraft that had launched that day, only about 130 returned. American losses were trivial by comparison, fewer than 30 aircraft in air-to-air combat. Japanese analysis had attributed this catastrophe to superior American fighters, to radar-directed interception, to the loss of experienced Japanese pilots. But standing here, understanding the sortie generation rates that Essex could sustain, Okumiya saw another dimension to the disaster. The Americans hadn't just shot down Japanese aircraft, they had maintained continuous combat air patrols throughout the day. They had launched strikes against Japanese carriers, they had recovered damaged aircraft, rearmed them, and launched them again. They had sustained a tempo of operations that Japanese carriers simply could not match. The lieutenant commander mentioned, almost as an aside, that Task Force 58 during the Philippine Sea operation had included 7 Essex-class carriers and 8 light carriers, 15 carriers total. If each could generate sortie rates comparable to Essex herself, the Americans could put hundreds of aircraft in the air, maintain standing patrols of dozens of fighters, and still have reserves ready to launch. Okumiya did the mathematics. 7 Essex-class carriers, each with 90 aircraft, totaled 630 aircraft. 8 light carriers with 30 to 40 aircraft, each added another 300 aircraft. Nearly 1,000 aircraft operating from a single task force. And those aircraft could be launched, recovered, rearmed, and relaunched faster than Japanese carriers could complete a single strike cycle. This wasn't just quantitative superiority, this was a different kind of warfare. Japanese doctrine assumed that carrier battles would be decided by carefully planned strikes, by concentrating superior quality at the decisive point. But if American carriers could generate continuous operations, if they could launch multiple strikes while maintaining defensive patrols, if they could simply outlast Japanese carriers through sheer operational tempo, then careful planning became irrelevant. The Americans would overwhelm through mass and endurance. The American officer, perhaps sensing Okumiya's thoughts, mentioned the air group personnel. Essex embarked not just 90 pilots but over 200 air group personnel, including spare pilots. If pilots were lost or became too fatigued to fly, replacements were immediately available. Aircraft losses were replaced from escort carriers that accompanied the task force specifically to ferry replacement aircraft forward. Okumiya thought about Japanese carrier practices. Each pilot was precious, carefully trained over years. When pilots were lost, they were nearly impossible to replace with equally skilled aviators. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups included pilots with as little as 6 months training, flying missions alongside veterans who had flown since before the war. The disparity in skill was enormous, and it showed in combat results. But the Americans, according to this officer, treated pilots as replaceable. Not individually, of course, but systematically. The training pipeline delivered a steady stream of new pilots, each with 200 to 300 flight hours, adequate for carrier operations. They weren't as skilled as pre-war Japanese pilots, but they didn't need to be. There were so many of them, and they flew aircraft with such overwhelming advantages in protection and firepower, that individual skill mattered less than coordinated mass action. The lieutenant commander asked if Okumiya would like to see the hangar deck. They descended through interior passages, the American officer leading the way, through corridors that seemed spacious by Japanese standards. Essex's internal layout was designed for damage control, with multiple redundant systems, watertight compartments, and emergency routes that allowed crew movement even with significant battle damage. The hangar deck was vast, even empty, with only a few aircraft undergoing maintenance. The space felt enormous. The overhead clearance meant that aircraft could be moved easily without worrying about tail surfaces or propellers striking bulkheads. The deck was clean, with clear markings showing aircraft spotting positions, fuel lines, and equipment storage locations. American sailors worked on a Hellcat with the engine cowling removed. Okumiya approached, observing their procedures. The men worked quickly, efficiently, but not with the meticulous care that characterized Japanese aircraft maintenance. They were replacing a cylinder, a task that on a Japanese carrier would have taken hours of careful work. These men had the old cylinder out and the new one installed in perhaps 30 minutes. They torqued the bolts, reconnected fuel and ignition lines, and closed up the cowling. The American officer explained that most repairs were performed this way: replace the damaged component rather than repairing it. The old component would be sent back to rear area facilities for reconditioning, but the aircraft returned to service immediately. This approach required enormous logistics, a steady supply of spare parts, but it maximized aircraft availability. Japanese maintenance practices emphasized repair over replacement. Parts were precious, often impossible to replace quickly. Mechanics became expert at repairing damaged components, at making do with limited resources. But repairs took time, and time meant aircraft unavailable for missions. They climbed back to the flight deck. The lieutenant commander pointed out the various stations, explaining how aircraft would be spotted for launch. Okumiya visualized the DIA process, comparing it mentally to Japanese procedures. American deck crews moved aircraft using small tractors, mechanical aids that allowed a few men to reposition heavy aircraft quickly. Japanese carriers relied more on manpower, with teams of sailors physically pushing aircraft into position. Every detail reinforced the same conclusion. American carriers were designed for mass production, rapid operations, and sustained combat. They accepted higher risks, lighter construction, less protection for aircraft in exchange for higher sortie rates and faster operational tempo. Japanese carriers were designed for careful operations, for preserving valuable assets, for quality over quantity. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but in the war that actually happened, in the sustained carrier battles of 1944 and 45, the American approach was overwhelmingly superior. Japanese carriers couldn't generate enough sorties to overwhelm American defenses. They couldn't sustain operations long enough to achieve decisive results. They couldn't replace losses fast enough to maintain strength. Okumiya asked the lieutenant commander about production. How many Essex-class carriers were built? The American consulted mentally. 24 were built, he said, though several were completed too late to see combat. Construction time from keel laying to commissioning was approximately 18 months for most vessels. Some were built faster, 18 months from keel to commissioning for a 30,000-ton carrier. Okumiya knew that Japanese carriers took 3 to 4 years to build, and that was before the war disrupted industrial production. Japan had laid down several carriers during the war, but completed only a handful. The disparity in industrial capacity was even more overwhelming than the disparity in operational doctrine. The American officer mentioned, almost apologetically, that many of these carriers were now being mothballed. With the war over, the Navy didn't need 24 fleet carriers. Some would be kept in active service, but most would go into reserve, maintained in condition where they could be reactivated if needed, but not actively crewed. This casual mention of surplus carriers drove home the final lesson. The Americans had built more carriers than they needed, more than they could even use effectively. They had such overwhelming industrial capacity that they could afford waste, could afford redundancy, could afford to build weapons systems that might never be needed just to ensure they had enough. Japan had never had that luxury. Every carrier was precious, every aircraft was irreplaceable, every pilot represented years of training. The entire Japanese Naval Air Force at its peak strength would have been a small fraction of American carrier aviation in 1944, and still Japanese planners had believed quality could triumph over quantity, that skill could defeat mass, that fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantage. Standing on Essex's deck, with the September sun warm on his face and the waters of Tokyo Bay calm around the anchored carrier, Okumiya understood with complete clarity why Japan had lost the Pacific War. It wasn't because of individual failures, or bad luck, or poor tactics. It was because Japan had prepared for one kind of war, and America had fought another. Japan had built an exquisite sword. America had built a factory that produced 10,000 adequate knives per day. The outcome had never been in doubt. Commander Okumiya left USS Essex that afternoon, with his notebook filled with measurements, calculations, and observations that confirmed what he had feared. In the weeks that followed, he would join other Japanese naval officers in studying American carrier operations, examining captured documents, and interviewing American personnel. The Office of Naval Intelligence employed several Japanese naval officers, including Okumiya, to write detailed analyses of Japanese naval operations for American use. This work forced these officers to confront, repeatedly and explicitly, the failures of Japanese strategy and doctrine. The reports they produced were brutally honest. Okumiya and his colleagues documented how Japanese carrier doctrine had been optimized for a short, decisive war against opponents with limited industrial capacity. They explained how the emphasis on quality over quantity had made sense when facing colonial powers in Asia, but had become a fatal weakness when facing American industrial might. They analyzed specific battles, showing how Japanese carriers' inability to sustain rapid operational tempo had led to defeat even when Japanese pilots achieved tactical successes. One report, produced in late 1945, examined sortie generation rates in detail. Japanese fleet carriers in 1942, operating under ideal conditions with pre-war trained crews, could launch approximately 6 aircraft in a coordinated strike requiring 90 to 120 minutes of preparation. Recovery operations took 30 to 45 minutes. Turnaround time between strikes was 3 to 4 hours minimum. This meant a Japanese carrier could realistically launch 2 major strikes per day, perhaps 3 if circumstances were favorable and combat damage minimal. American Essex-class carriers, the report noted, could launch 90 aircraft in 30 to 40 minutes. Recovery took similar time to Japanese operations, but turnaround between strikes could be accomplished in 90 minutes to 2 hours. This meant American carriers could launch 4 to 5 major strikes per day while maintaining continuous combat air patrols. Over a sustained campaign, American carriers generated 2 to 3 times as many sorties as Japanese carriers of comparable size. The implications had been devastating. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carriers had launched multiple strikes against Japanese forces, maintained standing combat air patrols that destroyed the majority of attacking Japanese aircraft, and still had reserves available for additional missions. Japanese carriers had launched their strikes and then been defenseless while waiting for aircraft to return, refuel, and rearm. The Americans had fought continuously. The Japanese had fought in carefully separated pulses. Continuous operations had defeated pulse operations completely, but the report went deeper, examining why this gap existed. American carriers were designed by engineers who understood industrial mass production. Elevator systems used commercial hydraulic technology adapted from skyscraper construction. Deck handling equipment borrowed from automotive manufacturing. Damage control systems incorporated firefighting technology from American cities' fire departments. The entire ship was designed so that relatively unskilled personnel could be trained quickly to perform specific tasks efficiently. Japanese carriers were designed by naval architects trained in traditional shipbuilding. They emphasized craftsmanship, careful engineering, and elegant solutions. Their systems required skilled operators who understood the entire mechanism. A Japanese carrier was like a fine watch, with every component carefully fitted and adjusted. An American carrier was like a factory assembly line, with standardized parts and procedures that any trained worker could execute. Neither approach was wrong in isolation. But American carriers could be crewed by sailors with months of training. Japanese carriers needed experienced personnel. American carriers could be repaired by any well-equipped naval shipyard. Japanese carriers often needed specialized facilities. American carriers could be built in 18 months. Japanese carriers took 3 to 4 years. The industrial implications extended beyond carriers themselves. American naval air groups were equipped uniformly. Every fighter, squadron flew the same aircraft type, used the same ammunition, required the same spare parts. Japanese naval air groups mixed multiple aircraft types, each with different requirements. American logistics could supply entire task forces with standardized supplies. Japanese logistics struggled to provide the diverse materials each unit required. Okumiya's reports noted that Japanese naval officers had recognized some of these problems during the war. By 1944, Japanese planners understood they were losing the industrial war. But understanding the problem and solving it were different matters. Japan's industrial capacity could not be expanded quickly enough to matter. Pilot training programs could not produce skilled aviators in the numbers needed. The shipbuilding industry could not build carriers fast enough to replace losses. The reports documented the steady attrition of Japanese carrier aviation. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. These were replaced, but the replacement process took over a year. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan lost 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft. The carriers could theoretically be replaced, but the pilots could not. By late 1944, Japanese carrier air groups included pilots with as little as 6 months total training, including as few as 100 flight hours. American pilot production, by contrast, was almost absurd in its abundance. Training facilities across the United States graduated thousands of pilots monthly. Not all were highly skilled, but all met minimum standards for carrier operations. The Americans could afford to lose pilots and replace them within weeks. Japanese losses were permanent. The story of American carrier superiority was not unique to naval aviation. It was repeated across every dimension of the Pacific War, from submarine production to merchant shipping to ammunition manufacture. The pattern was always the same. American industrial capacity produced adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities, defeating Japanese quality through sheer mass. American shipyards built submarines faster than Japan could sink them. By 1944, American submarines were strangling Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off the home islands from raw materials in Southeast Asia. Japan had begun the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By August 1945, less than 2 million tons remained, much of it damaged or unusable due to lack of fuel. American submarines themselves exemplified industrial design philosophy. The Gato-class submarine, which formed the backbone of the American submarine fleet, was designed for mass production. Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire built these vessels on assembly lines adapted from automotive manufacturing. Components were standardized. Construction time decreased as workers gained experience. By 1944, American yards were completing submarines in 8 to 10 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japanese submarine production was slower, more careful, and emphasized larger, longer-ranged vessels designed for fleet operations rather than commerce raiding. These were sophisticated weapons, but Japan built only 54 large fleet submarines during the entire war. American yards built 203 Gato and Balao-class submarines, flooding the Pacific with vessels that destroyed Japanese merchant shipping with methodical efficiency. The same pattern appeared in aircraft production. American factories built over 97,000 fighters during World War II, including over 12,000 Hellcats specifically for naval aviation. Japanese factories built approximately 30,000 fighters total, including all types for both naval and Army air forces. American bomber production exceeded 77,000 aircraft. Japanese bomber production was approximately 15,000 aircraft. These numbers represented more than industrial capacity. They represented different philosophies about warfare. American planners assumed that equipment would be lost, that attrition was inevitable, that sustained operations would consume material at rates that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. They built production systems designed to replace losses and maintain strength indefinitely. Japanese planners assumed that quality would reduce losses, that skilled crews would preserve equipment, that careful operations would allow forces to remain effective despite limited production. They built production systems designed to provide the best possible equipment to forces expected to make that equipment last. Both assumptions were rational, based on different models of warfare, but the war that actually happened favored American assumptions completely. Combat consumed material at extraordinary rates. Attrition destroyed experienced units. Sustained operations depleted forces that could not be quickly replenished. American forces could sustain losses that would have been catastrophic for Japanese forces. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the United States lost the carrier Lexington and suffered damage to Yorktown. Both were large fleet carriers, representing significant combat power, but Yorktown was repaired within days at Pearl Harbor and returned to service in time for Midway. Lexington's air group was transferred to other carriers. American carrier strength was barely affected. When Japan lost carriers, the losses were permanent. Carriers sunk could not be replaced quickly. Pilots killed could not be retrained rapidly. Air groups destroyed could not be reconstituted with equally skilled personnel. Each loss weakened Japanese naval aviation in ways that could not be recovered during wartime. By 1944, the mathematical inevitability of defeat was clear to informed Japanese officers. Commander Okumiya had known, intellectually, that Japan was losing. Standing on Essex's deck, he understood viscerally why defeat was inevitable. The Americans had built a war machine so vast, so productive, so overwhelming in its material strength that no amount of skill, courage, or fighting spirit could overcome it. Japanese propaganda had told the people that American wealth made Americans soft, that material abundance corrupted fighting spirit, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American materialism. Standing on Essex, Okumiya saw the truth. American material abundance had built ships that could sustain operations indefinitely, aircraft that could be lost and replaced within days, crews that could be trained in months rather than years. American wealth had not made Americans soft. It had made them unstoppable. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Japanese military culture emphasized that proper spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Soldiers were taught that Japanese troops, properly motivated, were superior to any enemy. Naval officers learned that Japanese seamanship and skill would defeat numerically superior forces. This belief system had worked in previous wars. It had worked against China, against Russia in 1905, against colonial powers in Southeast Asia, but it had not worked against the United States. American forces were not inferior in spirit. They were adequately trained, properly motivated, and believed in their cause. And they had overwhelming material superiority that made comparative fighting spirit irrelevant. Japanese soldiers could fight with extraordinary courage and still lose because American forces could simply bring more firepower to bear. Commander Okumiya's post-war career reflected his efforts to understand and explain why Japan had lost. He worked with American historians on several projects, documenting Japanese naval operations. He co-authored Zero, a book about Japanese naval aviation that became one of the most widely read English-language accounts of the Pacific Air War from the Japanese perspective. He lectured at American military institutions, explaining Japanese doctrine and its failures. His central message was consistent across all these works. Japan had prepared for the wrong war. Japanese military planners had assumed a short, decisive conflict where qualitative superiority would achieve victory before American industrial potential could be mobilized. They had assumed that attacking Pearl Harbor would so demoralize the Americans that peace negotiations would follow quickly. They had assumed that dominating the Western Pacific would create a defensive perimeter that Americans would find too costly to breach. Every assumption had been wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor had unified American public opinion for total war. American industrial mobilization had proceeded faster than Japanese planners thought possible. The defensive perimeter had been breached repeatedly by American forces that accepted casualties Japanese planners thought would be politically unacceptable. Most fundamentally, Japan had misunderstood what kind of warfare would decide the Pacific conflict. Japanese planners had prepared for decisive battles where qualitative superiority would matter. The Americans had fought a war of industrial attrition where quantitative superiority was decisive. Japanese carriers were magnificent weapons, designed for elegant efficiency. American carriers were adequate weapons designed for mass production and sustained operations. Magnificence lost to adequacy, multiplied by overwhelming numbers. The lessons extended beyond World War II. The post-war American military would internalize the principle that logistics and industrial capacity were as important as tactical skill. The ability to sustain operations, to replace losses, to maintain forces in the field indefinitely became central to American military doctrine. The Korean War, Vietnam War, and subsequent conflicts would all feature American forces with overwhelming material advantages, even when tactical situations were challenging. For Japan, the lesson was different but equally profound. The nation that had challenged a superpower with inadequate industrial capacity would become, in the post-war era, an industrial superpower itself. Japanese manufacturing would adopt American mass production techniques, improving them with Japanese attention to quality. The same nation that could not build carriers fast enough during the war would, in the 1980s, produce automobiles and electronics that dominated world markets. But in September 1945, standing on Essex's deck, Commander Okumiya was not thinking about future economic development. He was thinking about the young men he had sent on missions, the pilots who had believed their training and skill would be sufficient, the crews who had trusted that their carriers would protect them. He was thinking about the calculations he had made, the operational plans he had written, the assumptions he had held. All of it had been wrong, not because Japanese officers were incompetent, but because they had misunderstood the nature of the war they were fighting. The Essex-class carriers, with their ability to launch over 90 aircraft in less than 40 minutes, represented more than technical achievement. They represented a nation's industrial philosophy made physical. They were built by workers who had never built ships before, designed by engineers using commercial technologies, operated by crews with modest training, and maintained by logistics systems that treated complex military equipment as if it were consumer goods to be mass-produced and easily replaced. This approach horrified traditional naval officers trained to view warships as carefully crafted instruments requiring expert crews. But it won the Pacific War. Essex and her sister ships generated sorties at rates Japanese carriers could never match, sustained operations that Japanese forces could never maintain, and achieved a dominance in the Pacific that made Japanese defeat inevitable. The final irony was that Japanese naval officers had partially understood this even before the war began. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he had no confidence in ultimate victory. He understood American industrial potential. He knew that once American production reached full capacity, Japan could not compete. Yamamoto had been right. Japanese forces had dominated the Pacific for approximately 6 months, from December 1941 to June 1942. After Midway, the initiative shifted permanently to American forces. After that, every major battle was decided by material factors that favored the Americans overwhelmingly. Japanese forces fought with remarkable courage and skill, but courage and skill could not overcome the material disparity. Standing on Essex in September 1945, Commander Okumiya represented thousands of Japanese officers who had come to understand this truth too late to matter. The war was over. Japan had been defeated so completely that American forces occupied the home islands, and the weapon that symbolized American victory was not some exotic superweapon or brilliant innovation. It was this carrier, this ordinary Essex-class ship, that could launch aircraft faster than Japanese carriers, that could sustain operations longer, that could be built in 18 months and operated by crews with limited training. Adequacy, produced in sufficient quantity, had defeated excellence produced in limited numbers. That was the lesson of the Pacific War, written in the steel of 24 Essex-class carriers, in the wreckage of Japanese carriers sunk across the Pacific, and in the notebooks of Japanese officers who had calculated their way into defeat by solving equations that did not describe the war they actually fought. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.